I want to welcome everybody to Girl Talk Apologetics. My name is Patty Trotty. I'm joining you from Indiana. My lovely co-host Ann Sands joins us from sunny California. And we have been co-hosting online apologetics book discussions for women since 2020. And we're both very happy that you've joined us for this important discussion, whether in the live stream or watching the video later. We just finished reading our 13th book, which was Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret, and we are very excited to have three special guests for our Q&A tonight. Marcia Montenegro is a former certified professional astrologer who spent 20 years in New Age, occult, and Eastern religious practices. Marcia now has a full-time Christian ministry, Christian Answers for the New Age, and has had many opportunities to speak at churches and conferences across the country, as well as being interviewed on radio stations, internet webcasts, and podcasts, sharing her conversion story and warning people about the deceptions and dangers of New Age and occultic teachings. In addition to co-authoring Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret, Marcia is also the author of Spellbound, The Paranormal Seduction of Today's Kids, and also has several published articles. Marcia has a master's degree in religion from Southern Evangelical Seminary and also serves as a missionary with Fellowship International Mission. Marcia, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Patty. Thank you so much for having me.
Don Veinot is co-founder and president of Midwest Christian Outreach Incorporated, a national apologetics ministry and mission to new religious movements. He and his wife, Joy, have been involved in discernment ministry as missionaries to new religious movements since 1987. In addition to co-authoring Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret, Don also co-authored A Matter of Basic Principles, Bill Gothard and the Christian Life, and is a staff researcher and writer for the Midwest Outreach Journal. He has articles published in several Christian, theological, and apologetics journals and other periodicals. He is a frequent guest on various radio and television broadcasts and is the co-host of the weekly Unknown webcast on the Midwest Christian Outreach YouTube channel. Don was ordained to the ministry by West Suburban Community Church of Lombard, Illinois, at the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem, Israel, in March of 1997. He is a charter member of the International Society of Christian Apologetics and also the current president of Evangelical Ministries to New Religions, a consortium of counter-cult apologetics ministries and missions to non-Christians. Don, thank you so much for being here tonight.
My pleasure.
Dr. J. Medenwaldt, also known as Psych Apologist, served in the Air Force for 9 years as a behavioral scientist, where he taught psychology courses at the Air Force Academy, did consulting, and conducted research. He earned a doctorate in social psychology at Baylor with an emphasis on psychology of religion and virtue. He also earned a Master of Divinity in Apologetics, Ethics, and Biblical Studies, a Master's in Psychological Sciences, and a Bachelor's in Behavioral Sciences. His research has been published by the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion, Current Opinion in Psychology, and Adolescent Research Review, and he's given presentations at the Christian Association of Psychological Studies, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, Evangelical Theological Society, and the Global Conference on Sport and Christianity. Dr. Medenwaldt is working on a book that offers a scientific and theological critique of the Enneagram, which we are looking forward to hear about more just a little bit. And Jay, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
And if any of you have followed us for a while, you might remember Jay's wife, Lindsay Medenwaldt, who did a special event presentation for us and also participated in a couple of our book discussions as well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the questions and hopefully get through all the questions for Jay before he has to leave the meeting. Our first question came from Kristen. And she says to Jay, your essay said, I don't think it can do what people claim it can do. After being told their numbers and following suggested changes or exercises, are the claims that the Enneagram worked based on just feeling better about themselves and their relationships? Or do they report actual changes like decreased stress levels and making new friends? Do they think they have found a path to God? Can you give a psychological answer on what it means by people think it works?
So the main thing where you see most of what people are claiming is just there's a subjective feeling that they are understanding people better, or that they are better able to communicate their own thoughts and ideas with other people better. And so there's not really clear whether that's just they have more confidence in themselves or understanding others, or if there really is some growth and change. There's been a couple studies that have looked at kind of change in a couple areas, such as like anxiety or identity development, and the results. So one, they're I say this without trying to be critical, but they're just really bad science. So for instance, one of them by David Daniels, who's a psychiatrist, they reported and they looked at two different groups, a group that did an intensive Enneagram training and a group that did a shorter Enneagram training. And there was no differences in change during that time. So the shorter one was supposed to be the control group, which isn't a very good control group because they should be doing something completely different. But either way, there was no differences. And so then we did an additional analysis that they shouldn't have done, and what we would call phishing or p-hacking, and just going to look for differences. And they found one group of 7, because there were the 2 groups, but each had subgroups within those. They found one of those groups that had a change, an improvement from before to after. But they didn't mark or mention the groups that had a decline because it wasn't statistically significant. And so it's kind of just fishing for things that resulted. And so it's just wouldn't get published in a good journal. It was published, but it was a kind of bad, low-rated journal. And then another one was there's an Iranian one that looked at anxiety in teenagers, teenage girls. And so it didn't really report or have a good control group. It didn't report when the year that happened. And so naturally you would expect maybe at the beginning of the year, people are going to be high in anxiety, right? They're just starting the school year. And then, a few weeks in or a couple of months in, that's going to go down naturally, regardless of whether they've done any training. They didn't really report that. They kind of didn't report some of the necessary statistics you would need to determine whether or not they grew more than a control group. So there's been some issues with that. So it's mostly and most people aren't aware of the science. They're just looking at their personal experiences. Well, I feel like I understand people better, or I feel like I understand myself better. That's kind of what they're hanging their hat on. Is that just subjective perception from their, before and after, which is fraught with issues of issues with that.
Could you speak up? I'm losing it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, Jay,
I can try.
Okay.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. But yeah, so ultimately we have a lot of times in psychology where people will feel like there's been a change or growth or something, but when we compare before and after actual more objective ways, there's not a change, or it's minimal.
All right, great, thank you.
Did that answer the question, or was there another part to that?
Yeah, I just don't, since I don't know much about it, the book did a really good job of not enticing you to go down the road of looking into it much. So I only know the information from the book, but they kept saying people feel like it works. I'm like, well, why do they feel that? Yeah. And you think it's mostly a subjective feeling that communication improved, better communication, more confidence. So that's kind of what I was after. I don't know if there's a spiritual side to that answer that would be different or add to that.
Can I add something in here? Just this is maybe a question, Jay, but because I've had several say to me, well, it has improved my marriage. And my question to them was this: is it that the Enneagram itself was beneficial to your marriage, or is it that you actually began talking to each other as a result of being challenged by this? So in other words, it's the talking to each other that caused your marriage to get better. This was just a vehicle to start the conversation.
Right.
What do you think on that?
Yeah, I think that's probably a lot of what's going on, or maybe even it's that vehicle that starts the conversation, and they do have maybe some short-term growth because of that, but then is it having any effects after a year, 2 years, right? Are those long-term things? And so people might get excited, oh, my marriage has been bad. Now we're talking about things and I'm so hopeful, but then after things go back to normal a month later or a year later, then it's, okay, well, it didn't actually have an effect. And so I think that's one of the issues with it is that, I don't think it's having an effect for lots of reasons. And so it's likely that's why I think we're maybe starting to get a little to the point where people are using it longer term and just kind of realizing it's not all that it's cracked up to be and just kind of silently walking away.
So more correlation than causation is what I'm hearing.
Right. Yeah. And I teach my students when we talk about correlation and causation, like maybe there's a causal relationship, but you don't know which direction, but sometimes there's a third factor. So there's a third factor causing both. That's the one that's the causal factor. And I think it's probably something like that with this, or even at most, maybe the Enneagram's a catalyst. So to say that that's good that it's starting those things, but when it leads you to false claims about people, it's going to hinder that growth after that.
All right.
Okay, so we have a second question from Vicky. This question for Jay. In your article, The Enneagram Science and Christianity, Part 2, the 12 reasons laid out for why the Enneagram works are so helpful. Which of the reasons in your experience hits hardest to those entrenched in their belief that the Enneagram works?
I think the biggest one is the Barnum effect, or sometimes called the Forer effect, F-O-R-E-R. And that's really this idea that we have when we're presented with personality information, essentially, universally valid is the term. So universally valid statements that pretty much apply to everyone. They're very broad, general statements that pretty much apply to everyone. We accept those as being individually valid for us. So we think it's just unique to us. And I'm actually, the original article on that was published in 1948. I'm actually trying to get that whole article reprinted in the back of my book, because I think when you read that and you see like, oh, like crap, this was predicted 60 years ago, right? In this article, he actually used astrology statements. He gave his students a personality test, and the next week he gave them all the same results, but they didn't know it. And he asked them to rate the accuracy of the results, and most of them said it was very accurate. They were astonished that it was the same results, and that spurred
So interesting
area of research for 30 years.
I saw the interview with Marcia recently on something, and she said, you'd been a professional psychic for many years, and people said, oh, well, the information you gave them worked. That was so accurate, right? So,
Yeah.
so you see what we want to see, or
Yeah.
Well, and the problem and the difficulty is these universally valid statements, they're accurate statements, they're true statements, but they apply to everyone. So it's hard to say it's not accurate, because it is. It's like, well, we're all that way, right? Or at least sometimes. And so it makes it in that difficult gray area. Is like, oh, describe me so well. It's like, yeah, describe you so well because you're human, not because it's describing you uniquely.
Yeah.
And so it gets really hard for us to understand, like, because a lot of it is about our internal thoughts that we don't necessarily discuss or see in other people. And so it can be really convincing. And so when I actually present, sometimes on psychology and apologetics or this topic specifically, I'll give a version of that personality test to people and have them go through it. And they'll read these Barnum statements, things like, I'm sometimes shy and introverted, but occasionally like to go out and be the life of the party or be around other people. So that would be what's called a double-barreled statement. So you get these kind of things and people are like, holy crap, that's me. And they'll even say, out of these 10 statements, they'll say 2 or 3 of them are eerily accurate and describe them like that way. But it's just like, these are just broad general statements. And again, they're accurate, true statements about you, but they apply to everyone. They're not unique. They're not uniquely identifying differences between people.
all right, thank you.
All right, the next question for Jay is actually from me. Since writing your 2-part article, The Enneagram Science and Christianity, what new data have you collected regarding the Enneagram? And feel free to tell us about your upcoming book.
And so in my book, I've done a couple unique things. One on the theological side is I've kind of gone in and kind of tried verifying a lot of the claims, the historical claims, at least in terms of like Claudio Naranjo and following up on his credentials. Where was he actually doing research? Was he the places he was? And for the most part, it kind of seems like he was in the places he claims to be and associating with the people, but it seems like in his writings, he overplays the degree in which he was actually engaged in personality research with people like Gordon Allport, David McClellan, and some of these other big name psychologists who were kind of instrumental in the formation of personality psychology. And so he was really seen like during that time that he was crossing paths with them very briefly or in the same kind of general area, same university or research institute. He was working on other things. And wasn't really working with them. But as far as my own data, collected some information on data on perceptions about the Enneagram and what people believe in general. And again, it's correlation, not causal, but there was a correlation between acceptance of the Enneagram. So people who accepted the Enneagram are more likely to also accept some New Age type of beliefs, or at the same time reject some kind of typical biblical doctrines, or even, for instance, this wouldn't be necessarily directly biblical doctrine, like they'd be more accepting of abortion, less likely to say it's wrong. So we get some things like that. We've also done some meta-analyses with some other data sets that's been published, or reanalysis of a few data sets, and looked specifically at how do the types relate to each other. And so some of the research trying to validate the Enneagram is basically just looked at and trying to show that there are types, which they more or less fails in doing that. But it doesn't evaluate any of the claims as far as movement between the types, how the types are supposed to be related, which that's really, the main part of the system. And doing that, looking at correlations between types and what's called a profile analysis, when you put all the data into a kind of analysis and see if types come out as expected. So based on the traits that are being tested, do they align with the types? And doing both of those different analyses, the answer is no. It's completely different than what the Enneagram would predict and how it's set up. So it just kind of, you would say, and this is the hard part, where you say, well, maybe the types do describe people a little better than maybe you would get by random. But then once you start limiting and saying people can only do one type, or that types move in a certain direction, have certain wings, or all these things, then that is from the data completely random. It would be just as accurate to randomly pick another type out of a hat to say that's your wing, or that's your thinking style, or that's your way of direction of growth, or whatever it might be.
All right, thanks. Sounds like another book we might be reading sometime in the future.
This is my question, actually, Jay. How would you respond to someone in ministry who feels the Enneagram is useful to help Christians identify sins and patterns in their lives so they can confess them to Jesus? Is there some other tool I can direct them to that does this?
So with each Enneagram type, there's one sin tied to each type. So the idea is, if once you identify your type, then it tells you what your kind of main sin is, and it will kind of walk you through how that sin manifests, which may be good on paper, but again, the problem is with that you're getting false information. And so you might lose your temper and yell at people, but your type's sin might be fear. And so the Enneagram's going to tell you it's not anger that's your issue, because that's a sin of a different type. Your issue is fear, and you're lashing out at people because of fear. You're like an animal cornered, right? And so you're really lashing out because of fear, not anger. And so it kind of can make people like, oh, I never realized that before, but it's also giving you false information. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, where it's like, oh, I didn't know that, and so, oh, that must be how I am, and that makes sense, because it kind of spins a story that makes sense, and it does, because often our emotions are closely tied together. But again, so it's like, oh, that really nailed me. It makes you feel accurate. But if it was really actually accurate, if that were true, you probably would have realized that beforehand, or you would have had a close person tell you that that. And so that would be one of the things I would recommend is doing this with people who are close to you, family or friends or pastors, or even actually just spend more time reading the Bible and actually reflecting on it, journaling and thinking through it. Or a couple books that I think would be really good for that would be C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters, or Pilgrim's Progress would be another good one. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and it kind of walks through some ways that sin often manifests or takes over our lives and might present itself. But really, you could just look at a list of sins, whether it's the 7 deadly sins, or even you could take the list from the Enneagram or any other list and just look and think through them and like, do I struggle with this? And just really be brutally honest with yourself. Think of situations. That's, I think, it'd be more effective and better than just saying, oh, here's my type and here's my sin, and this has to be my sin because this is my type. But really, maybe it's not. And so, for instance, the type closest to me, the one that seems to describe me best, would be type 5, and the sin is avarice, which is actually the absolute lowest thing that I struggle with. So it's the exact opposite for me. And so some people would say, well, then you've got your type wrong. But it's like, well, then that may be true, but then other parts of the system are wrong as well then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, the last question that's directed for Jay is actually mine. Jay, do you ever need to separate your views as a psychologist from your views as an apologist, or do they always complement each other?
So I was thinking about this. Would you mind just explaining a little more what you mean by that? Because I think I know, but I just want to make sure.
Okay. Do your views as an apologist, are they ever like stronger or more, I don't even know if I know how to articulate this well, but do they ever conflict? Like, do you ever have to separate how you view things psychologically and how you view things like biblically or from a biblical perspective?
So I've never struggled with this. I've never seen any conflict, but I think where sometimes psychology gets a bad name because there are a lot of psychologists who have views that oppose the Bible, and the psychology as a field can be very conflicting. And so like the prime example of that right now would be on sexuality and gender, and you'll get psychologists or people in related field, they'll cite a lot of research and they'll stand very confidently behind it, but when you actually read the articles and see what's being done and what research is happening, it's like there's nothing in conflict. It doesn't matter if people have say if there are some genes that maybe predispose people to be more likely to be homosexual or transgender. That doesn't mean it's morally right or wrong, or that even that's not still culturally influenced, right? And so once you kind of peel away some of the rhetoric that you hear from people and you look at the actual empirical data, there's not an issue. And more often than not, it actually is the opposite, where psychology really promotes Christianity specifically. So there's a recent article, it's a popular article someone wrote and did a video on it, which got some popularity, about how cognitive dissonance theory can explain the resurrection. It's like, well, no, actually, understanding cognitive dissonance theory makes it harder to do that. Like it shows that cognitive dissonance cannot explain the resurrection. It actually understands the theory better, and you kind of lay out things in kind of the chronological order instead of just picking and choosing things that seem to fit this predisposed idea.
All right, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Jay, you're off the hook if we need to lose you now. So thank you for coming. I appreciate your unique insight as both a psychologist and an apologist. That's a unique intersection. So the next question is for any of you or all of you three. This is from Gretchen. In general, do you recommend personality tests at all for personal growth or improving relationships? Or do you think categorizing people into types is antithetical to Christian character growth? And is there a place of usefulness for clinically researched personality tests?
I'm going to go first, and I suspect all three of us may have different views on this. And I'm going to start with the last part, the clinically researched. Jay is more on the science end of psychology. which I appreciate. He does a very good job of that. In general, I am not a fan of many of the aspects of psychology. So my cards are on the table then. I don't find a lot of use personally for personality test. I don't see much difference, for example, what you might find in a Cosmo magazine versus some of these other quote tools that you come across. They by and large are based on how people feel about them, not how they're scientifically tested out. And Jay's already commented a lot on that. What I do find is lacking in the church is actual discipleship. And if we're actually discipling people, the issues that we're concerned about come out in those relationships, where you can have a more mature believer helping a maturing believer get through these issues. I'm married 53 years now, dated her 3 years before that. Our church sends a lot of people to us for marital counseling. What is that? Well, we sit down and we share our experiences, we find out what their issues are, and we focus on really one thing there. How do you talk to each other? How do you fight? They go, what do you mean, how do we fight? Well, if I know how you fight, then I know how we can do problem resolution. If you're a gunslinger and the other one is more reticent, that's a problem because you want to solve the issue right now. The other one wants to think about it, consider it, and you're not allowing each other to do that. None of that has to do with personality typing. This just has to do with who you are as a person, how do you deal with these issues. And I think we can do that from a biblical perspective if we have churches discipling their people. Most of them are not.
Harder work than taking a test, right?
Yeah. Well, we've kind of gotten into this McDonaldized version of the church. You just keep churning out the Christians like you churn out hamburgers or fries. They don't work like that. You have to spend time knowing people, growing people, praying with them, finding out what it is that's driving them, what are they afraid of, what are their fears. I deal with people in cults, and I have to ask one question, and that is, what are they invested in? If I can figure out what got them in and what's keeping them in, I know how to talk to them. That has nothing to do with their personality. It has everything to do with they bought into a concept that's keeping them in the group. You get that in your relationships. You buy into a concept about the other person, and you can't get past that because you have made an investment in your belief about them.
I would say a lot of the research and things in terms of like relationship stuff focuses a lot on communication.
Yes,
as well. So if you
definitely.
really, regardless of what your personality is, if you learn how to communicate effectively, the personality part, I don't want to say doesn't matter, but becomes easier, and that's a big deal. But on the personality side, I do think there's value in it for a couple reasons, but also just understanding in general how scientists look at personality. So if you ever take a test that categorizes you into a group, that's not a scientifically validated personality test. So that it's immediately when you categorize people, you lose data and information about the person, especially because most people are actually usually in the middle on things. And so with like the Myers-Briggs, the most popular one, 50% of the time people will get a type, and that's because most people are pretty close to the middle on one or more of the factors. And so when they take it when they're in a different mood or just things have been a little different, they might end up on a different. And so really the big five is the most popular test. Mexico would be basically the same thing with the factor. And that's going to give you a score on a continuum of different factors in the big five. So the conscientiousness would be the one that often predicts behavior the best or outcomes. And so you maybe and your spouse take the big five, or maybe the church does that. And you look at your scores on conscientiousness, and maybe it'll help you understand, like, okay, well, I'm always on time and I want to get things done and have things neat and organized, and see that, okay, I'm high on conscientiousness, and that's what that means. Whereas maybe my spouse is low, and help you understand why they don't care that the house is a little bit messier, they're running behind, and that can help you recognize that that may be an area of conflict for you, and that's to your personality, and so that you can help both kind of be more understanding and be more comfortable with that person's personality, or even adjusting your personality, because it's not just where you are in personality, but your range and flexibility that we can learn to be comfortable in areas. And so if my wife's really conscientious, and she is more conscientious than me, I can learn to be more conscientious and certain things that matter to her, knowing that maybe I'm less conscientious and I can do that, so that it is easier for us to get just so it gives us more ability to focus on other things or whatever it may be. So I do think there's value, but often it's overstated how much value that can actually have, especially the stories that really giving you the depth about what those different concepts mean and how it affect interactions in day-to-day life.
Yeah, your audio is kind of fading out again.
You know what? This
Right.
is not on the agenda or in the thing, but I kind of have a follow-up question, because I hear this over and over again, that people seem married to their numbers, or, you know, like holding tightly to, like, this is who I am, or other people, this is who you are. And that seems, and is it something specific to the Enneagram that is causing this?
No, that's their
Or-
investment point right there.
Yes.
They're invested in that.
That is antithetical, I would think, to the not own your number and hold tightly to it, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So I'm just wondering, is that specific to Enneagram, or is that a personality test artifact thing?
I think it's
would
probably-
oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to say something about, as a former astrologer, it is very much like astrology. People who identify with their zodiac sign. And if they know more about it, like if they've had their chart done and they know where their moon is and they know their rising sign and everything, then they're like, this is why I'm doing that. I'm a Pisces, but I'm Sagittarius rising. So I'm like that. And that's why I act that way. It's this self-focused, in my opinion, self-focused need to identify with something, because I think it actually makes people feel special.
Mhm.
Even though there are a lot of other people identifying with the same type or zodiac sign. I really see it as very, in the way people react to it and the way people think about it and start identifying with it, it's very interchangeable with astrology. And so you're categorizing yourself in this artificial category, and you start filtering, when you start filtering your experiences through that type, just like when you filter your experiences through your zodiac sign, it becomes more real. And it starts becoming your reality, in a sense that you're believing it more, and you're start noticing things more that correlate with what you think, oh, my type, my type 4 is, or whatever it is. And then it verifies it in your mind, like, oh yeah, see, that's really me. And that's why I talk that way to, my husband or whatever. And it works exactly like astrology. And I've told people this. I've said, the more you identify with your Enneagram type and the more you think it's you, the more real it's going to seem. And you're not going to really see things the way you should see them. You're going to see them through this false filter of your type, because you've just put this, type, here's type 4, and I'm seeing everything through type 4. And that's what you do in astrology. And I imagine you do it with other things as well. You could do it with other things too, like numerology. If you turn out your life path as a 7 or something, you'll start interpreting everything through the life path of a 7. And that, I think that's a human thing, to identify with something. For a lot of people, I mean, I think there are exceptions, but the people who go for these things seem to be the kind of people who want to identify in some way with something there that I think for them, they think it's an answer, and they think it's going to explain things about why they like things, or why they do things, or why they fail at things. They think there's some kind of answer there, kind of almost like a magical answer that will help them understand everything better. So, I mean, I think that's why it's almost like it really is like an addiction. And
Yes.
that really, really married to it. And now, I'm hearing from people that are encountering people who've been doing the Enneagram for a while, and these people are so entrenched in it, they absolutely will not hear anything against it. And what they do is the people who are criticizing the Enneagram or trying to expose it, they will completely cut them down. They'll use ad hominems. I just got one yesterday and today from someone who shared some information from me about the Enneagram with this man that she knows. And oh, you should see what the things he said about me. I'm like a fundamentalist from the Bible Belt. And I'm just like, it makes me sound like I'm this kind of almost crazy, wild-eyed, uneducated, goofy
Well, you're
person.
pretty close.
And they'll paint everybody against the Enneagram as this kind of, because they have to, because they've invested themselves in the Enneagram and they don't want to think they're wrong.
Right.
So that it just picks up speed as it goes along.
I need to run here, but I just want to add, so I think any system that puts people into types or categories, that's more likely to happen. And so for instance, with like the big five, introversion or extroversion, so the scale is extroversion, but we kind of, as a society, sometimes call people introverts or extroverts. You hear people use that language, but you don't hear that with the other the other factors. You don't hear someone say they're a neurotic or a non-neurotic because we don't have language and types. One is just the idea, just because there's that categorization that lends itself to that, and then as Marcia was saying, you get kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy. You start to see that over and over again, and it kind of works together. But to the credit of the Enneagram, you're supposed to transcend beyond that. So it's got the right purpose, I would say, behind that. The problem is that's just not the way our minds work. Like, we have loads of data and research on that through psychology that, like, when we do that, when we have these categories and things fixed, like, those usually become, rather than something we break free of, it usually becomes more of a self-fulfilling prophecy and limitation. Or even the big issue with the Enneagram, your type never changes. So you can cope with it, you can learn to adjust and take on things with other types, but your type will never change according to the Enneagram. So at some point, and I think we'll see this hopefully in the future, people are just like, enough. And they kind of either give it up, or I think that's where you get people like Marcia was saying, where they just get fully endorsed in, where it's like, okay, no, I'm doing this because this is just who I am. And so it kind of, again, the idea is that you're supposed to transcend it, but again, I think that's very rare likely going to happen, where more likely people are going to self-stereotype and limit themselves for the long term.
Well, thank you, Jay. We need to say goodbye to you.
Well, we have one more. There's one more question for all three, any or all three of you. And Jay, if you want to and have time, you can go first. This is from Kristen. And she says, if you could create a giant marketing campaign that would reach all 3rd to 5th grade students, what message other than the gospel would you use to fight for their hearts and keep them from believing the cultural lies that are most destructive? You want to tackle that one, Jay, before you leave?
I think I can give a quick answer to this. I've actually thought about it a lot, and again, based on research and conditioning and how we make our minds choose things. I think if Christians were viewed as both kind and intelligent, which means we actually teach our kids, we train other people, and we do it in kind in some way. I think if we were viewed that way, that message would kind of be implicit in everything. I think that would have extremely powerful effects. And most people who are walking away, I think, wouldn't, and we get backed out of people who want to be, because they want to be like the Christians and want to have.
I'm losing you, Jay.
And there would be more to it, but those would be the main ones.
Freezing up a little bit.
Yeah, I think their connection's going off.
Oh, good.
My connection's going.
Yeah.
I gotta go.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
Jay. Thank you. All right, Marcia or Don, do you want to answer that one? Do you want me to read it again?
Yeah,
No.
please
Okay.
read it again.
Okay. If you could create a giant marketing campaign that would reach all 3rd through 5th grade students, What message other than the gospel would you use to fight for their hearts and keep them from believing the cultural lies that are most destructive?
My goodness. I'd have to try. I don't think I have an answer. I'd have to think.
I
a
would
lot
do
about it.
something like, why do you believe that, as a campaign? The whole goal is to, when they're young, I don't know how many of you remember when yours were young, they had one question that they always asked all day long: why? And then as they get a little older and they start going to school, they stop asking that question because they are now being indoctrinated into what they ought to believe. And if they ask questions, they're kind of shut down from doing that. I had a lady, I have to do this by a story. I love stories. First time I went to Israel, I had a woman sitting next to me on the plane, and she was reading some New Age tripe of some kind. And so I asked her what the book was about, and she started telling me, and then I asked her another question, and she gave me this, "Go away, you fundamentalist bigot." See, I've been called that before, Marcia. And I thought,
This is
"This
by
is
a
fun."
Christian, supposedly calling me that. This is a Christian.
Yeah, I know. And so I asked her the question again, and finally she closes the book. She goes, "Okay, you want to talk about this? Let's talk about this." And she started running down all the reasons why she's not a Christian and why I'm a fundamentalist bigot. And I said this: "How did you develop your worldview?" And she stopped and she said, "What's a worldview?" And so I explained it to her. And she said, "I'm fascinated. I've never heard about this before." And we spent 11 days in Israel answering all of these questions that she had. And as it turns out, she was raised in the church. She would ask her pastor these questions, hard questions. And he would say, "Oh, Danny, you just have to take it by faith." And after a while, she said, "It doesn't make sense to me." And so she got involved with something called the Urantia book, which is a cult.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she was involved with the Urantia book when I met her. And so she recommitted her life to Christ. She became like a powerhouse apologetics woman in Cortez, Colorado, which is really,
I've met Danny. I met Danny at
Danny's
Santa
fun.
Fe.
It's fun.
Yeah, in Santa
That's
Fe.
how we met.
Yeah.
What was her problem? Her problem was she was shut down from asking the big question. I think, in my opinion, we need to cultivate that. Why do you believe that? As a national campaign, homeschoolers can do this. I've had a couple homeschooling groups I've worked with that said, you need to start teaching logic classes to your third and fourth graders. Don't wait until high school. Teach them, if they got to learn a foreign language, have them learn Koine Greek. And then when the pastor's standing up front and says the original Greek it says, they can go, "No, that's not what it says."
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Don. I think those are good ideas. I'm all for logic. I think, and there is a book that was put out. I can't remember who put it out, on logic and teaching logic to children. And I had one of the books, and they put out several. I don't know. I think they still exist and still publish. I wish I could think of their name. And I think it was a husband and wife, and they put out these really good books on using logic for children. I mean, I think that's definitely a good one.
It is. I mean, you talk about the gospel. Well, the gospel is of course key. You want to get there.
Right, right.
But the Christian faith is made of evidence, reason, and logic. And we find the Lord using that all the time. He uses great rhetoric with the Pharisees. He uses question and answer. They come to him with a problem. We got you a problem. And he doesn't answer he asks them a question back.
Yeah.
That they have to deal with. That's logic and reasoning. Yeah, that's what I think. Start them third grade logic.
Yeah.
All right, Anne, you want to go to the next question?
No, I love that because we have read books by Greg Koukl, and his big thing is, how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, tactics.
Basically, why do you believe that? And in fact, I posted something on the Enneagram based on your information, and someone wrote, this is all false. Go back and do your homework or whatever. And my response was, I would be happy to. Which which fact do you take it, which point do you take issue with? And please give me your source so I can we can educate ourselves. Silence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's easier to just take pot shots than to actually have a
Right.
conversation.
But
also,
in fact, Marcia has sent several to me to say, how do I talk to my pastor? Because I'm kind of the guy that says, here's how you talk to your pastor. And I say this. First of all, make me the bad guy. I don't care. I'm used to it. Second of all, here's how you do that. I'm going to send you a copy of the book. And you want to ask your pastor to do you a favor because he's your pastor, to protect you from believing false things because you need to be protected from false teachers. Would he read this book and anywhere he finds it a problem as far as being false to tell you what it is so that you can have me confront it? Now that puts all the pressure on the pastor.
I love that. And I'm gonna use that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Previous
In fact, we just did a video with Doreen Virtue. She had me get all dressed up because I wear Western stuff all the time. It's my into talking to New Agers and occultists and fringe jackets, Indian beating, cowboy hat, and it sparked conversations. And so she had me wear that, and I had a couple of weapons, axe and a rifle, because I have so many people that are being harassed and they don't know what to do. And my stock line is, just because they invite you to a gunfight doesn't mean you have to show up. You don't have to fight all the personal battles, and this is one of them. You don't have to fight that battle. You don't maybe know enough about the material. Ask your pastor as your protector and shepherd to read the material, and if it is false, to let you know where.
Thank you. That's amazing. There's also, we were mentioning worldview, and Marcia, you were saying people start interpreting everything through the worldview, and you were saying, how did you develop your worldview? And everything about this seems so self-focused. The interpretive grid is who I am, as opposed to the interpretive grid being who Jesus is, right?
Right.
Okay, so this is a question from Vicky. It is, should the Enneagram be considered a separate concern from New Age and or occult practices, or are they intersecting practices under one umbrella?
Yeah, I think I saw that question as was directed to me. I think, am I correct? Okay. Yeah, I consider it part of the New Age. I mean, that is where it really got its start, with esoteric teachers, and went into the New Age and really flourished there and was developed there. It fits the New Age worldview, and everything about it is very New Age. The mythology, the way the methodology, and the way people use it, and the way people identify with it. The goal of it is New Age, to uncover the true self, and so I would consider it a New Age tool. So I think you are using a New Age tool, even if you try to Christianize it and say, I'm a Christian and I'm just going to, use it with a Christian worldview. You can't do that with a New Age tool, because it's based in the New Age. It has a New Age spiritual purpose, and you can't just, that's like saying I can use astrology as a Christian tool. That's like saying I'm going to just rename the zodiac signs, and I'll name them they'll be the 12 disciples, or the 12 tribes of Israel or something. and then I'll interpret it, that way. I'll make it fit the Bible. Well, then you're just, making something up, and you've changed it. It's not really astrology anymore, in a sense. So you can't just take something that's designed a certain way with a certain worldview in it and a certain purpose that's New Age, and then twist it into some kind of Christian tool. And furthermore, why? I mean, why do we even need the Enneagram, is my question. And, I was always asking people, why are there don't you wonder, why are there 9 types? Who says there are 9 types? Where did that come from? What's that based on? So, just there's no purpose in doing it at all, of course. And so I do see it as a new age tool. And because there is a spiritual element to it, I think that and I've said this in many Facebook posts, and I know Don can verify this because I think he's heard me say it, because there's a spiritual element in it, it is going to do damage in the church. And I mean, I said this, 3 or 4 years ago, like back in 2019 or something. And that's exactly what it's doing. It is causing damage. It is spreading a lot of bad theology and bad people and bad teachings. And it's a spiritual tool, and it cannot benefit Christians.
What's the worst bad theology that it's spreading, do you think?
I think that probably, well, there's so many. I think one of the main ideas that pushes it, maybe Don can think of others, is that this is going to make your walk, you're going to have a better walk as a Christian. You're going to be closer to God with this, because you're going to know yourself better. This, one of the big ideas was, if you want to know God, you have to know yourself. And they completely misuse the quote from Augustine, and I think Calvin quoted him. And so they refer to that out of context, and they say, see, so you have to know yourself to know God. And of course, that's not biblical at all. And people just buy into it. And I have heard so many pastors say that. I've watched so many videos of pastors and other Enneagram teachers or pastors who are promoting it, and they'll all say that, well, you have to know yourself to know God. So here's how you can do it. You can do it with the Enneagram. And so that is just poison. And people, I guess, a lot of times they don't think about it, and they think maybe because this pastor is saying it, they accept it as true. And then they just go with it. And that is one of the biggest false ideas theologically of the Enneagram.
It is. It points you to yourself.
Yeah.
Now, we've dealt with quite a number of groups over the years. We exposed Gwen Shamblin and Wade on Workshop. And her big thing was, you need to turn your eating desires over to God. And everything was focused on that. But guess what you're focusing on that entire time? Yourself, your eating habits. You're not focusing on God. Consequently, you start losing a relationship with God and other believers that aren't in your club. So it starts that problem. This does the same thing. It focuses on the number one person in your life. And that number one person in your life is not God. It's you. So biblically, our task is to think more and more about God, and the other things begin resolving themselves as a result of that. If I'm busy serving you and you and you, I have less time to worry about what's going on with me, because I'm focusing on God and the people He's put in my life. So we have it completely reversed, and the Enneagram embeds that into your thinking.
And it becomes a replacement. I've also said it's becoming a replacement for Scripture and for the Holy Spirit.
Correct.
Because they start measuring things by the Enneagram. How am I doing with my quote unquote sin pattern in the Enneagram? Or my sin is this because I'm a 8 or whatever. And you aren't looking at Scripture anymore. You're looking at the Enneagram. People may be throwing verses in there or attaching verses from the Bible to it, but you aren't really going to God's word for it. And you're being guided by your own thinking or your own ideas of how the Enneagram is supposedly leading you and guiding you. And so then that's interfering with your sensitivity to the Holy Spirit. And I think that's one reason it's so destructive in the church.
All right, thank you both. Now the remainder of the questions are for either of you or both of you. So we'll just leave it up to you to decide if you want to respond or not. The first one was my question. Some people would object that rejecting the Enneagram because of its occultic origins is committing the genetic fallacy. In other words, rejecting a claim based on its origins and not its content. How would you respond to this objection?
Before Marcia says anything, I want to say this.
I
If
was going to
you-
let you say it.
If you have not seen the discussion between her and Todd Wilson, you have to watch that. That
Oh,
is the thing that he tried to use on her. And you said what?
yeah. I said sometimes the origins matter. I said sometimes the origins matter. And I gave an example and I said, but it's not just the origin of the Enneagram, it's the nature of the Enneagram and the purpose of the Enneagram. It's not just a question of what the origin is. It's what is it and what is its purpose.
And
And
it's not valid. It's not a valid psychological.
it's not valid. Yeah, it's not valid. And the real irony of that whole debate was it was on Unbelievable. And if you want the link, I can, send it to you. The real irony of that is that he was trying to make me look like a quote unquote fundamentalist who was against science. And he was the scientific Wheaton graduate. He kept referring to the fact he went to Wheaton and Cambridge. Yeah, he was bringing that in. And so as though, okay, he's the enlightened scientific Christian and I'm the ignoramus. But what's funny is here he's accepting something that's completely unscientific. It was just almost, it was almost like a little thing that had all been arranged as sort of a funny play or something. And I think, and people saw that because if you look at the comments on it on YouTube, you can see what they could see through this kind of effort of his to try to sound scientific, but it's actually completely invalid. And I think I said at one point, well, if the validity isn't going to matter, then why not just use astrology?
Right.
I mean, really, why not? So yeah, I think you can see some tactics in there from the pro Enneagram people and some responses that you could give. I mean, the Lord was really with me in that because I almost didn't do that. I didn't want to be in that kind of position because one thing I thought I was going to get mad. I thought I'm just going to get so mad. I don't know if I can restrain myself. But a lot of people were praying for me, and I prayed for a really calm spirit, and the Lord gave it to me. So I'm really glad I did it.
That was a great interview, by the way. I did see it.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yeah, that was
right. There are many things where the origins are not relevant. Whoever invented a hammer, it doesn't matter. It's just a tool that you pound nails down with, or work on your car or whatever. That it has no spiritual or intellectual significance at all. Math is another one. We have a lot of great math that was done by non-Christians. But it doesn't teach us morals, ethics, or anything like that. It's just math. This is passed off as a spiritual tool.
right.
Origins matter, where it's leading you matters, and it's not a valid psychological tool either. So it just fails on all counts.
Right. If something is neutral, because this came up a lot from people, and people who were talking to people about the Enneagram would be told this, it's a genetic fallacy. So Don and I were both getting a lot of people coming to us saying, what do we say? And, if it's a neutral thing, like he said, a hammer, or the wedding rings apparently were pagan. The origins of wedding rings is pagan. But does that make it wrong to wear a wedding ring? Well, of course not, because it's just an object, and standing for the marriage. But in itself, it's an object. So if something is neutral and it's not spiritual, then the origins don't matter. But if you have a spiritual tool that's supposed to tell you about yourself, then it does matter. It's not a neutral. The Enneagram, in other words, is not spiritually neutral. That's the bottom line.
Kind of a follow-up to this, by the way, is another claim that God can redeem anything.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I'm a little more crass than Marcia is on my response because I like questions and I like shock value at times. Is it true that God can redeem anything? And so then my question is, can God redeem prostitution? And everyone stuffs back, well, he can redeem the prostitute. I go, that's true. But he's redeeming a person. He's not redeeming an activity that is
Yeah.
on its face sinful. So no, God doesn't redeem prostitution for his own benefits and advantage. He's opposed to that. It is sin. This is the same thing. He doesn't redeem everything. He redeems that which is redeemable. This isn't redeemable.
Yeah, I have an article on my website called "Can God Use or Redeem Everything?" Because that was another thing that people would
Right.
hear from people defending the Enneagram. They would say, well, this person's told me, well, God can redeem anything, and so and then they wouldn't know what to say because they don't want to say, well, God can't redeem, because it sounds like you don't think God can do something. So they don't know what to say. And you just have to point out all the things that God condemns in scripture, all the occult practices he condemns, and immoral behavior. And certainly, is God going to redeem the Ouija board, or tarot cards? No, I don't think so. They don't have anything redeemable about them.
Right.
Same with the Enneagram. It doesn't have anything inherently redeemable. Therefore, it's irredeemable. And God is not going to redeem it.
Originally, it's sort of based on numerology. I mean, like Gurdjieff and just. Well, this next question is from Carol and Vicky, and it is a great follow-up to what we were just talking about. It is, how would you answer people who defend their enthusiasm for the Enneagram, either by saying, well, it doesn't hurt anything, or by equating its false ancient roots and questionable origins to pagan roots of widely celebrated customs around Christmas trees or Easter eggs?
Okay. All right. So once again, on my website, I have an article called Christmas is Not Pagan. And I have another one called Easter is Not Pagan. And I have been posting these on Facebook for over 10 years. And I finally made them into articles on my website because I heard this as a new Christian. And I was even kind of felt guilty celebrating Christmas because I thought, oh, it's pagan. And I'd heard these tales about it. Well, then as time went by, I started discovering that this is not true. Christmas was actually started by Christians. And even the date, December 25th, was a date based on the service of John the Baptist's father in the temple, Zechariah, where they had certain times of year to go to the temple. So the early Christians came up with what they thought might be the birth date, which was December 25th. And it was not a pagan holiday, and it was not turned into Christmas because it was a pagan holiday. And so I learned all that was false. And the first Christmas trees were used by Christians. Now, there's a couple of stories about them. One is that it was like in Lithuania or something like that in the 15th century. And another one was that it I'm sorry, I can't remember the other story. But apparently there is no credible evidence for the Christmas tree being of pagan origin. And people also take Jeremiah 10 out of context, which talks about chopping down the tree and decorating it with gold and silver. And what that's talking about, of course, is making idols from the tree, making little, chopping the wood up and making an idol that you're going to worship. It's not talking about a Christmas tree, which of course didn't exist anyway, because it was Jeremiah. They didn't have Christmas yet, but that doesn't seem to bother people. They think that's about the Christmas tree. So if you really, when people who challenge me, people get very mad when I did this post or I posted my article. A lot of people didn't like it. And I would just say, you have to show me the facts. You need to show me something historically factual that supports what you're saying, because I can show you historical facts that show it's not pagan.
Right.
Same with Easter.
Right. Put the burden of proof on them. So, okay. So we have undermined that argument. So you were saying, say, wedding rings, but something else that actually does have pagan origins that maybe we use or do, and what's the difference?
Days of the week, pagan origins,
Days.
everything,
Okay.
right? Months of the year, pagan origins. But things change over time with usage. And so whatever the deities that were being proclaimed in the days of the week when the calendar was first created no longer apply. Most people don't even know about those beings.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
And also,
Thursday is
I like your point about spiritual use. I mean, the days of the week, it's not quite a hammer, but it doesn't have spiritual impact or
right.
right.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not, there's nothing, you're not committing some kind of sin because it's Thursday and you exist on Thursday and it was named for the god Thor. You
Right.
know, it's not
Or
relevant at all
Woden
to your
or
spiritual beliefs. Yeah. And Wednesday comes from Woden. I mean, these come from Norse gods.
right.
And Friday comes from Frida, who's a Norse goddess. So, you know, you can't help it because the world, you know, after it turned away from the Lord and very early on and fell into sin, paganism was very common. That was pretty much what was around. And, you know, everything was pagan. Therefore, a lot of things have pagan origins. But if they're neutral and they're spiritually neutral, especially, you know, well, that's just the way it is. And that has no bearing on your walk with Christ or, you know, your morality or anything like that.
All right, great. Thank you. The next question is something that both Cheryl and Carol were wondering about. What's the most effective way to caution a Christian who's involved with the Enneagram?
Oh,
It's going to depend on the Christian.
Yeah.
Is it someone who is just wondering and is open? You can talk about them. Is it someone who's using it and finding that it's seemingly helpful? You've read tactics. What would you do? Ask a question. I often before I ever read, in fact, as we went through Greg's book with our small group, I kept saying, I think he's been following me around because I have done this like 30 years. This is I like questions. I tell people I do evangelism by judo. I let them punch out, I step to the side, I take a hold of their arm, and I help them continue to the floor. Ask a question, see how they respond, offer them a piece of cake, let them think about what you're asking so that they can digest it and come to their own conclusion. If we try to force them into a belief system, they are going to resist. If we grant them the opportunity to cogitate it and think it through before they answer, they are going to be more likely to come to a better conclusion.
So
yeah, I think I'm sorry. I was going to say, if they haven't really gotten into it deeply yet, and they're kind of wondering, or maybe they just started with it, and then they kind of heard that somebody maybe said, oh, you know, you shouldn't do that, or it's bad, and they might be wondering, they might be more open. And, you know, I usually say to them, or tell the person who's dealing with someone like that, ask them if they want the facts. Just ask them, would you like the facts about the Enneagram, which is not a threatening question.
Right.
And, you know, and then if they are open, I would think, and they, you know, they'll say, yes, I need more information. That's a great
starting question. And I think that was the point of both of these ladies' questions was if you're, you know, talking to someone, in a brief minute, what's the approach? So yeah, that's a good, wonderful suggestion. Thank you.
I like that. I mean, I guess I used to be an atheist. You know, my skeptical brain is thinking, well, who's to say your facts are more credible or your resources are more credible than mine? I mean,
well, yeah, they might have that reaction, but then, you know, if they're really asking or willing to hear what you have to say, then you can say, and they might even say, well, why should I believe your facts? And I say, well, I can show you, I can back them up, I can support them, with documents or with historical facts, which is what we did with our book. So, because I've had people tell me when they've shared my information with someone who likes the Enneagram, and they've said, well, Marcia just didn't do her research. Like, oh no, I've only been researching it since the late 1990s. I guess I haven't researched long enough. But it's that's the way to dismiss it, because they don't want to hear it. And when people don't want to hear the facts, or they don't want to hear any criticism, then they'll have that kind of reaction. People who really want to know will at least be willing to consider that what you're going to share is factual. And then you can always say too, well, we'll research it yourself, see if I'm wrong,
Unfortunately, especially, I mean, this is a human thing, but especially Christians, we place a lot of weight on the opinion of those we trust. The evangelical spiritual gift is referring and recommending things. And so when someone you trust, a mentor or someone with supposedly more spiritual knowledge or in a position of authority in the church recommends it, then you assume, well, they know what they're talking about.
Yes, that's very true. And I've seen that as a problem, because they've gone to somebody, or they've listened to somebody who's, got several degrees and, is a pastor or has a ministry, and he's endorsing the Enneagram. And who am I, Marcia Montenegro, who has probably never heard of me? And so who's this woman over here who thinks something's wrong with the Enneagram? What does she know? And that's just kind of the way it is, and you can't do anything about it. So if someone wants to think because I'm a nobody, then, and they won't, or anybody who's against it they might see as a nobody, therefore I'm not going to listen to that person. Well, then they're making a choice. It's not a very good choice. It's not a good decision, and they'll have the consequences to that. So sometimes you just have to be realistic and like, okay, they don't want to hear any criticism. And so that'll even be an excuse. Well, who's that person? Why should I believe her? Well, okay, if that's the way
that is also a logical fallacy, the appeal to authority.
That's true. That's
right.
true, Don.
So now I grew up as an atheist also. So I came to the faith really kind of through biblical prophecy and then apologetics, because I came to realize that I couldn't say God doesn't exist. That's a claim I can't prove. So I thought I could be an agnostic that would be safe, except I didn't like being agnostic because it means I don't know anything and I like knowing stuff. And I eventually became a Christian, kind of step by step. So I always need to be open to being corrected and correctable. Marcia is too. That's really important. When we do our books, even the Enneagram book, we had 20 people review it just to make sure we dotted the I's across the T's. We wrote our book on Bill Gothard. We had 40 scholars, college presidents review the book and red pencil. Norm Geisel red pencil the thing to death on me just to make sure that it was accurate. That's important. The second thing is, my wife says this sometimes in her articles. She goes, just because you heard it from the pulpit doesn't mean it isn't really stupid. Yeah. We are to
only our pastor says that, so I'm very encouraged. I actually trust someone way more when they're like, check what I say.
Yeah.
It's important. Yeah. My pastor, he'll be preaching along and occasionally he'll stop and he'll go, now, what I'm going to say next may be your problem, and if it is, Don will tell me. So, poor guy's got 3 apologists going to his church. Yeah.
Okay, so this question is actually for me. Someone I know, I understand, has just read the book Healthy Feelings, Thriving Faith, and finds it interesting. Are you familiar with its authors? The couple, Bill and Christy Gauthier, their organization is called Soul Shepherding. And what insights can you give?
Yes, this question is definitely my question, because I have written several posts on Bill Gauthier, who I discovered. I don't know how I came across him, if someone sent me a link. or what, but yes, he has a ministry, I guess he calls it soul shepherding. He's very much into the contemplative teachings, which is a whole other area, but it intersects very heavily with the Enneagram. And he was really into the Enneagram, and he was giving a presentation at a church. And I've actually seen 2 or 3 videos of him at different churches talking. And I'm just going to read a couple of quotes he said. Here's one. At the center of the Enneagram is our Lord Jesus Christ. He is the perfection of all 9 types. They integrate in him, closed quote. That's an exact quote. I listened to it and got the wording exactly right. And that's what he said. So he puts Jesus in the center of the Enneagram. I mean, I found this extremely disturbing. And he's the perfection of all 9 types. So Jesus is really, the Enneagram is really Jesus, and these 9 types are all perfected in him. So that's one of the things he said. So this is how much weight he gives the Enneagram. And here's where you see the problem, where it's probably coming from. It's coming from Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr is the reason that the Enneagram is in our church. And since you've been reading our book, you know why we say that, and why we say it's important to know about Richard Rohr. He called Richard Rohr a great Christian teacher, and he also said Rohr was a very wise teacher. And here he's talking about a heretic, Richard Rohr, who thinks Jesus and the Christ are not one and the same, who thinks that sin does not separate us from God, who teaches that Jesus did not die on the cross for sins. He teaches we don't need salvation or reconciliation with God because we're already in God. He teaches that the first incarnation of Jesus was creation. So, God is already in creation, and we're already a part of God. So we're not separated from God. This, nothing Richard Rohr really teaches, when you look at his theology, nothing is Christian, and most of it is from perennial wisdom. And this is where, this kind of gets a little more complicated, so I'm not going to get into it too much, and I think it's in our book, but perennial wisdom is getting into the church partly through the Enneagram and the contemplative teachings, because a lot of the contemplatives, I think, are perennialists, either knowingly or unknowingly. And so that's why he's saying things like this. That's why he's okay with Richard Rohr, I think, because of his apparent admiration for Richard Rohr. It's hard for me to believe he doesn't know anything that Richard Rohr believes. It's hard for me to think that. And he also, in this talk, recommended the New Age book on the Enneagram by Don Riso and Russ Hudson, who they founded the Enneagram Institute, which is a New Age organization. And Don Riso died, but he was a New Ager. Russ Hudson is, I call him the uber New Ager. He's about as New Age. If you want to see the example of a New Ager, look at Russ Hudson. Yet Russ Hudson, interestingly enough, I know this is off the top of Gaultier, but Russ Hudson taught several Christians the Enneagram. And so you have a New Ager teaching Christian teachers who become Enneagram teachers or are teachers in other ways. They have learned about the Enneagram from a New Ager. And that, to me, says, first of all, either they're very undiscerning, or if they realize that Russ Hudson's not a Christian and he has what would be called New Age views, then there's a couple of things you have to think. Okay, they don't care. They're like, all right, I don't care. The New Age isn't that bad. Or they're even sympathetic to some New Age ideas. I mean, who knows? Maybe only the Lord knows the answer to that. But that says a lot right there. This is where you see the damage of the Enneagram and how it's opened the doors to there are these little crevices where this stuff is leaking in, like Richard Rohr is leaking in, perennial wisdom is leaking in, and you're getting these ideas that are not biblical. And so these posts that I did on Bill Gaultier, which I can send you the links to, whoever wants them, show that where he's coming from. And I did, since I had done 2 or 3 posts on him, then apparently he made a statement about the doctrine, the Bible doctrine police. He said that our ministries received a lot of criticism and, quote, judgmental attacks from Bible doctrine police, close quote. I think he's referring to me. I'm not aware of anybody else who was criticizing him, although I could be wrong. And he said that was because of his ministry's use of the Enneagram. And I have even a screenshot of him, of where he said that. So my assessment,
because doctrine doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, and he probably wouldn't say doctrine doesn't matter. The way that I think he would put it would be like what this man said about me that I was referring to earlier, that the Christian faith is not about right beliefs. And that's become kind of a catchphrase for people like this. I think Richard Rohr has said the same thing, maybe not in the exact same words, and that's a lot of progressives say that, and these contemplatives say it. And people like Bill Gaultier, Christianity is not about right beliefs. So in other words, you're so obsessed with right doctrine, you're being real picky and you're judging people by, oh, can I check this off? Do they believe this? Check. And they make it sound like this very judgmental, harsh, limiting kind of thing. When actually, I mean, right doctrine is important because, the content of the doctrine matters, because you can have a doctrine about a lot of things that are false. So, he's upset because the Bible doctrine police are after him. And so he makes it sound very negative. And that's what all these people do. And like I say, they probably wouldn't just outright say doctrine doesn't matter because they know that wouldn't sound good, but they'll say it's not about right beliefs. That's their way of saying doctrine doesn't matter. But they try to make it look like, the people who are quote unquote judgmental are being real picky and kind of on a witch hunt.
And this is kind of a weakness in the church in general. It is forgotten largely that nearly all of the New Testament was written for a particular purpose, to correct false teachers, false teachings, bad doctrine, and bad behavior. Nearly every book in the New Testament was for it.
Yeah.
The Gospel of John, even, how does it start out? Refuting heresy. The first 18 verses are refuting heresy that was traveling through the church at that time. So, yeah, it's really important, and all of the biblical writers took it as really important.
Watch your life and doctrine closely. Watch your life and teaching closely.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
27, in fact, of the New Testament books, all except Philemon, address beware of false teaching.
Right.
Yes, they do. And I
think it's being set up often by that kind of, it's not about right beliefs. It's set up as a false dichotomy. Like everybody who's interested in checking the boxes, you're not worried about love and right behavior. Right. Well, it's not either or.
Exactly.
In fact, you kind of have to have the right teaching so that follows naturally, right? But anyway, so Patty.
All right, the next question comes from Kristen and Cheryl, and it's a good follow-up to the last one. Many times we feel like the only Christian on the watchtower of our local church who is concerned about issues like the Enneagram. What suggestions and/or encouragement would you give, especially to those of us with no credentials, for voicing concern to church leaders who promote the Enneagram?
Oh boy, wow.
This is a church polity question, so it becomes difficult to just say, here's what to do. It's going to depend on how open the leadership is to information garnered by those in the congregation. If you have pastoral leadership that's willing to hear you out, consider what your concerns are, then go to them. If they are not, that's going to make it difficult. If you have a trust relationship with them, perhaps he could talk about setting up a sort of a discernment group within the church that you can vet books for them because they can't read everything. That you could become a resource to them so that they could even approach you to go, you know, I've had someone suggest this book. I don't have time to read it. Can you tell me what you think of it? And you can do the research on it. In other words, you become a servant to the church, not a nag of the church. I'm not saying you are a nag, but you could be perceived that way,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I've had to do that. I mean, over the years, I've had to build relationships with pastors all around my area as a servant to the church, not as someone who wants something from the church. That comes across better. Not all churches are going to do that. Some of them are just so bent on what they want to do that they're not going to hear anybody that's going to conflict with their plan. So
Yeah, unfortunately, Don and I, we've got, both of us were getting questions. And a lot of times when I got this kind of question of someone in their church and find out the pastor's going to start, you know, he's recommended an Enneagram book, or they're going to start having Enneagram classes in the women's ministry or something. And I've emailed Don and added him to the email and with a person. And, you know, we try to find out what their situation is in the church and, you know, what the pastors are like. Would they be open to, you know, maybe even reading our book or something? So you kind of have to know the situation, but, you know, you always, like Don said, you always want to approach it very, you don't want to come across as here's why, you know, the Enneagram's wrong, like right off the bat, because they probably, if they're promoting it, they're not going to be very receptive. So you have to, I go back to, do you want the facts about the Enneagram? You know, ask your pastor, would he like to know more? Or Don has suggested saying, how did your pastor find out about it? What does he know about it? You know, why is all of a sudden now he wants to teach it? Well, what inspired him to do that? Because that could help us understand the situation. So it helps to have a context, I think, for why the pastor is for the Enneagram or seems open to it. And then how open is he maybe to what you might present to him in a way that is helpful. You know, you want to be a helper to the pastor. You know, I want to help you look into this or something. So, but it's hard because a lot of pastors, what we've discovered over and over again the past several years, is a lot of pastors are not receptive at all, and people have left their church. A number of people have left their churches because of the Enneagram, including a pastor. Remember that pastor,
right.
Don, that you and I talked to? He went to the other pastors with the information. They had like 2 meetings where he explained why they shouldn't be doing the Enneagram, and they still wanted to do it. And so he left, and there he was. He had no job. All of a sudden, overnight, he had no job. And the Lord, you know, took care of him, because we found out people from the church were helping him, bought him groceries, and his daughter became one of my Facebook friends. And, you know, but that was very hard. That was hard to do. And sometimes it's a hard thing to take a stand on truth. Sometimes if it's not, the person isn't receptive to the facts and you're there out in the cold, you know, because they're kind of, some pastors will even say, well, if you can't participate in this and you're going to have a problem with it, you know, maybe it's better to go to another church. I mean, there are actually pastors who have said things like that to people. And, you know, that's very hard to do. So this is where your faith in Christ has to be, you know, your strength. You have to, you know, fortify yourself with scripture and prayer, taking a stand on the truth, and realizing that we can suffer because of that, even in the church.
Yeah. So, you know, understand this. This might be helpful. Understand this. Most pastors gain their information on what they might do next through what I call the good old boy network. Pastor Fred down the street, he's my friend. We have lunch, we go golfing, whatever it is. We do stuff together. He's my friend. he's doing this to great effect. His church is growing. I will do it because he does it. I know him. I trust him. He's theologically good. And so they get involved with it. So now your question is not simply a threat about a product he's using. It's questioning his friendship with Pastor Fred down the street.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So now it gets complicated. And we have what I picked this up from Norm Geisler. He was talking to somebody else about issues with the Southern Baptist Church, and he said, "Why are they having so much trouble in the denomination?" And the individual said, "Well, because it is fraternity over orthodoxy. I can't admit my friend is wrong. He's my friend."
Mm.
So that comes into play sometimes. And
Yeah.
that's why I say we have to take it church by church. If you have a good relationship with your leadership, you should be able to talk things through to say, how can we serve the body here the best? Because there's a lot of questionable stuff out there. And brainstorm. A lot of times they like, because they want people to serve, and they can't do everything. Other churches are not into really having congregational serving in those areas. They don't trust them enough. That makes it harder.
Those are all really helpful suggestions and considerations. Thank you.
Very. I also, thinking back to your answers to a couple other things where you said, you were kind of saying, ask Marcia, what inspired the pastor to get interested in that? And that sort of picks up what you said about people in cults, like what caused you to be invested into this.
Right.
So why are you invested in this? So we can look at that. And then also the other thing you had said earlier about, well, here's another book. Can you read this and tell me where I'm maybe misunderstanding?
Right.
help me understand, educate me.
Or maybe not even that. Could you read this? I want to make sure I'm not going to be deceived, and you're my shepherd. Could you help me with that?
Right. Since there's a conflict, and what do I know? I don't have an MDiv.
Right.
So, yet, no.
See, the investment thing is really, really important. We've got a young guy in our church. Well, not so young, but he's been being discipled by my pastor and myself, and he's very interested in missions to cults and non-Christian religions. So he goes to, we went to the Parliament of World Religions, where I ran into Richard Rohr, by the way. Got a with him, that was kind of fun. And that's where he was talking about how we need to introduce psilocybin into the church as a sacrament of the church.
Who said this?
Richard Rohr. Yeah, that was great fun. We wrote an article on it.
Didn't he ask for a copy of your book?
Yes, I sent it to him.
Have you heard back from him since he?
No, not a word.
Oh, okay.
When I sent it, I put a letter and asked him to have this guy take a picture of him with the book and send it to me, but he didn't do that.
Psilocybin. How is, okay, so okay, we have two more questions, but I barely can stop asking questions. How is this guy not excommunicated? This is what I want to know. Like, how is he towing the line? How does he still have I get it that he's not priesting. He doesn't have a church or a parish or something, but how is it? How?
I have tried to look into this. I saw him talking to a group. Actually, I think it was at a perennial wisdom place, and it was a video, and I've looked for it since, and I cannot find it. And in the course of that video and that talk he's giving, he says, well, I was investigated by the Catholic Church 17 years ago, and they cleared me. And then, okay, so that video is at least 5 years ago. And then a couple of years ago, he went and met the Pope, and he gave the Pope a copy of the Universal Christ, which is a completely heretical book. I mean, it's so heretical. And apparently the Pope either said he read it or he liked it or he would read it. He made some kind of positive comment, and there's like a picture of Richard Rohr with the Pope. So now that gives the impression that he's got the blessing of the Catholic Church. He's got the blessing of the Pope on him. So either, I don't know if the Pope really read it. I don't know. Either they're interpreting it and they're giving it they're trying to give it a biblical meaning, which you can do if you really stretch things. and you're reading, you're saying, oh, well, he can't mean that. He must mean this. Okay. That kind of thing, which I think happens a lot. Or for some reason, they just, he's older, he's had cancer. I think he's actually in poor health right now. When Don saw him, he was in a wheelchair, right, Don?
He wasn't in a wheelchair, but he's moving kind of slow.
Oh yeah, he's kind of in a weakened state, and he's, I don't know, I think he's 78 now, which isn't real elderly, but it's older. And he's officially retired, I think, from running his Center of Action and Contemplation. He stepped down from that. So maybe their thinking is, okay, we're just going to let the guy alone because, they don't see the harm. They don't see what he's doing is harmful. And also somebody told me, and I assume this is somebody who maybe knows about this more than I do. They said that the Catholic Church is more hands-off with people in the orders.
Right.
So he's in the Franciscan order. And they're more hands-off because they believe in letting the people in charge of the order. So it would be his immediate superior and whoever maybe is above that for the Franciscans. It's up to them to bring a complaint to Rome, to the Vatican, and they have, for whatever reason, haven't done so. So I think there's several factors at work that have kept him from being called out by the Catholic Church, even though what he's teaching is heretical. And he can talk for a long time and not sound heretical, because that's the other thing. He says things that may sound okay and you're interpreting them in a Christian way, but what he means by them is not biblical.
Right. It's always a matter of definition. Our book on Bill Gothard, we just updated and re-released it. The problem with Bill Gothard comes down in every instance to definitions. He uses the right verbiage in his teaching, but he gives you, and he does this quite openly, his definitions, like grace is something you earn. Right, that's an oxymoron.
Yeah.
We spent 6 weeks, 2 hours a morning, every Monday morning, just going through that one issue. And at the end, we kept saying, this is Roman Catholic. This is not biblical. At the end, what he decided to say is, the Catholics aren't wrong about everything. And I said, well, that's true, but they're wrong on this. So you have the same thing with Rohr. He's using the right language often, but he gives different definitions. He tells you what they are in his books.
As Patty would say, same vocabulary, different dictionary.
Yeah.
Right.
Same dictionary, different, one of those. Anyway, so this is Kristen's question. Where do you see Orthodox views, correct evangelical views, regaining ground? Are there organizations beside West Christian Outreach and Cana that we should have on our radar? Do you see any kind of network growing, or do you see historical Christianity just being canceled at every turn? And Kristen, this sounds like you're asking this about anything, not just Enneagram. Yeah.
Well,
boy.
I do. You have groups like Evangelical Missions to Non-Christian Religions. That's a consortium of ministries like ours. Now, some of them focus on specific groups, like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or something. Some of them are like Marcia and I. Well, Marcia's New Age. Me, I'm like whatever. Throw them at me, I'll see if I can talk. So the International Society of Christian Apologetics, they have some very fine ministries associated there. Now, we do different things. They are more academics there. I'm a charter member there, but their papers and stuff are more academic in nature. So if you don't like the $12 words, you're going to have trouble with them. But great. And there's ministries associated with them. Of course, Greg Kuckel's ministry, you can't hardly go wrong with that. Melissa Dowtree does a really good job, I think. So there's several of them out there, but you sometimes have to look for them. But if you have questions on specific issues, contact Marcia or me. And if we don't have the answer, we will connect you to somebody that does.
Great. Marcia, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I kind of think that it's hard to answer the question because I don't really I can only see what I see and notice what's going on. I know there's a big progressive movement of progressive Christianity in the church, and that is going away from orthodoxy. And that's very strong and has been strong for a while. And Alyssa Childers deals with that. But, I here and there you see bubbling up, little ministries or some apologists who are grappling with some of these issues. And I think that's just the way it is in the church. I think, and then it depends on your view, your end times view. I mean, I personally think we may be seeing the falling away. And because it does say there will be a falling away, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's possible. And so we're going to see that, something like progressive Christianity and the Enneagram, but God preserves his church. And there's always a remnant. So God preserves his people. The believers grow stronger in the face of, opposition and bad teachings, because bad teachings really drives you back to scripture. If you're really a believer, you go back to scripture. You see what the truth is. The false teachings highlight the truth. The shadows, when there's a light coming, it really, it's really stronger. So the light of scripture highlights all the shadows, and you can see more and more of the falseness when you know the Bible better, because you notice things that are off. So I don't, it's a sad thing to see people going away and to see the progressive movement and see the Enneagram get popular. It's very sad, and I feel people are being damaged. At the same time, I know God's in charge. I trust him. He knows what's going on. He's allowing it for a purpose, and his purposes are always good. And so I just trust that. It's like, okay, that's what's happening. I'm sad about it, but this is in the Lord's hands, and he's in charge of the whole shebang. And so I'm just going to do my part. And there are people out there who are, contending for the truth. So they are out there.
That's a good word. Thanks.
I think,
go ahead, Don.
I think one of the things that happens to us is we look back. Now I'm over 40 now, and we look back and we remember an America that seemed more Christianized. It had a Judeo-Christian value system, but that doesn't mean they were more Christian or biblically literate.
Right. Yeah.
Right. What we have over time is a loss. I'll put it this way. In the 1960s and 70s, we had a sort of a Judeo-Christian society. When we move into the 80s, it became a Christian hangover. When we got into the year 2000, the hangover wore off, and now we're seeing the benefits of that. So the Christian influence is largely gone in our country. Now, that doesn't mean the church has gotten weak necessarily, because the church was never all that strong. It has kind of moved through peer pressure. How do I know that? I love history. I love history. And the thing I see as I look down through history is God, the people of God have always been disobedient. Every generation from Abraham to the present day. That hasn't changed. You have a small group, as Marcia said, a remnant of those who hold fast to the faith. They are stalwarts for the faith. And everyone else is off doing whatever new agey occultic thing that they can get their hands on that makes them feel more spiritual. It happened in the Old Testament. It happened in the early church, and it's continuing today. It's just more apparent to us because the Christian hangover has worn off, and so it's more visible to us.
Makes sense. All right, the last question for tonight. And if you have other questions, we know how to contact Don and Marcia and Jay. So feel free to do that. The last question is, what new developments concerning the Enneagram have you observed since this book was published?
When our book was published, there were 12 pro-Enneagram books on the market. Today, there are, how many? 100 and...
Over 140. I haven't done a count in about a year, but it was about 140 a year ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
40
Wait, when were there 12?
Publishers. Pardon?
When were there 12?
In 2020, when our book was published.
Yeah,
The
it
first
really, it,
book that started this whole thing off by IVP, The Road Back to You, as of 2 months ago, crossed the 1 million sold mark. This,
yeah,
yeah, this is huge, huge, huge money.
yeah. And IVP had a little announcement about it, about how it had gone over 1 million. And I did a Facebook post on it. Don shared the information and I did a Facebook post on it. And, here it is, over 1 million. I think it's probably still the most popular Enneagram book in the church, by two disciples of Richard Rohr.
Right.
And so what we started noticing at first, Don and I were keeping track of how many Enneagram books were coming out. You remember those days, Don?
I do.
We
Yeah.
could say, here's number 15.
Right.
And then
Here's number 32.
and then it got it just flooded and we couldn't keep track anymore. And be like, wait a minute, when did that book come out? How many is that? And I remember Don saying, I don't know, I've lost count. And it's like we couldn't keep up anymore. And I noticed that they started addressing, and this is something I said would happen too, just like astrology can be used for everything. You can use it for marriage counseling, you can use it for parenting, you can use it for, your career. That's how they're using
church membership classes.
Yeah, it's church membership, it's discipleship, it's teamwork, it's leadership, it's prayer, parenting. It's reached into all areas so that it's become this tool for everything in your life. And that has, and there's even with contemplation, the contemplative aspect of it. And it's just gone on and on and on. It's like there's no end. I mean, IVP came out a few years ago with a whole series of devotionals for each Enneagram type. So, if you're a 2, you have the devotional for Enneagram 2. And they had a video promoting this, and they had the guy, they had different people who did each devotional who were that type. And this guy who did, I'm not sure it was 2, but I'm just saying that as an example, whatever his number was, 2 or 3. And he's sitting there and he's talking about, and he said, oh, this book just, it helped me so much to read this. I got so inspired. He said, it was just wonderful to access the wisdom. I thought he was going to say the wisdom of Christ. And he said the wisdom of the Enneagram, which is a phrase I've heard from other people. I think Bill Gaultier's used it. And so instead of talking about Christ, he's talking about the Enneagram as a source of wisdom. And it's part of wisdom tradition. That's another way it's been defended. It's part of wisdom, like the book of, I was told, well, it's like the book of Proverbs. It's wisdom. I think Todd Wilson used that in our debate. He briefly refers to this wisdom, this idea of wisdom traditions. That mentality of wisdom tradition, I'm not saying that's where they got it, because I'm not sure, but that's perennial wisdom. I'm reading a book on the history of the people involved in the development of perennial wisdom that was recommended to me by a friend of ours, Dr. Ron Huggins, who is a scholar. He is a scholar. He's got so many scholastic degrees and publications that he's been published, and it takes 5 minutes to list them all. Because when he's introduced, when the Enneagram conference we did online, who introduced Ron? I can't remember.
Bill McKeever.
Bill McKeever introduces Ron. It takes him 5 minutes to read all of Ron's credentials. So Ron, I forgot why I brought Ron Huggins up.
Because you're reading the perennial book he recommended.
Yeah. Oh, yes. He recommended this, but he's the one who helped educate me on perennial wisdom, because he already knew some things about it. And he helped educate me and was telling me things, sending me messages, writing stuff, and looking, he let me quote him in my post. And he recommended a couple of books to me, and I've read them, and I'm reading this one. So I am understanding a lot better now than before. And this idea of wisdom tradition is the perennial idea that there was originally this wisdom that man had access to, and that got lost, and that you have to regain, go back and regain that grain that was that part of the perennial wisdom, the ultimate reality, which they call God. And so the words wisdom and tradition are used a lot by perennial followers. And it's interesting how it's cropping up in the Enneagram like that.
Right.
So that's just something I'm noticing. I'm still tracking all that.
And we also have another thing that's kind of new since the book came out. Baylor University offers a certificate for the Enneagram, Christian University. There are 2 or 3, I think, that are doing.
Yes, I did a recent Facebook post on that. One's in Canada, Tyndale Theological School, but the other one is in the United States. It's in, I think it's in Chicago. Am I right? Yeah, I think so. And people were most surprised at that one. Well, what it was is they have a spiritual formation program, and then
Right.
if you go read the description and the person in charge of it, she teaches the Enneagram. So there you have it. So I don't know that they teach the Enneagram, but they have the Enneagram as part of their spiritual formation program.
Right. So that's how it's creeping into the universities, the Christian universities, is they make it part of the spiritual formation. So you have contemplative prayer, Enneagram, those kinds of things being taught in your Christian universities as spiritual formation.
Yeah, and spiritual formation is now in so many Christian colleges and seminaries. And so I don't know if the Enneagram has crept in, into all of them or whatever, but I see it definitely as a possibility, and maybe it has happened, and it's very hard to find that out unless you go search out the website, and then it may not even be on the website. So you have to have somebody tell you.
Right.
But in this case, it was on the website. I just did a search, and I forgot how I did it, and that's how I came across it. So a lot of people in the comments were very upset about this school doing that. And I was trying to make a point about the intersection of spiritual formation and the Enneagram, and how there's an intersection there, because I've been warning about the whole spiritual formation thing for a while. So it's they're kind of mixed in.
Here's another intersection that is not directly connected, but is tangential for some reason that we can't figure out. Almost wherever you find the Enneagram, you find CRT. Wherever you find CRT, you almost always find the Enneagram. They seem to go hand in hand into the various institutions. I don't know why that is, other than progressives perhaps take them both in there, but somehow both of them walk hand in hand into churches and different institutions. They don't come from if they come from Satan, they come from the same source, but they're different things, they're different tools, directly connected, and yet they seem to travel together. It's a really weird thing.
Yeah.
It's been a lot that's developed since you wrote your book.
Yeah, that is a lot. Yeah, like the things from the universities and everything. That wasn't going on when we read the book.
Yeah. Well, everybody, I think it's time to bring this to a close. Don and Marcia, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I want to thank you both for all the research you do and all the resources that you make available for those of us who need that kind of information as we defend the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Ladies in the live stream, thank you so much for sticking with us and being a part of this discussion. And I guess we'll just say goodnight and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yes, please send questions if you have them.